In this video, I'd like to look at how we can make these flagella, like these hair-like objects, in this case on a bacterium. I've used this in a different video about rendering in Arnold, and I'm not going to look at modeling all this exactly, but just a bit different approaches to make these hair-like objects. And the ultimate way that you choose to do it will depend on what you want to get out of it. If it's an animated thing that has to be driven by dynamics, or you'd like it to be driven by dynamics, then we can use nHair to make something like that. If it's something you want to be able to pose more directly, then it's something you might have to model as a piece of geometry and then rig using something like an IK spline. So we'll take a look at that. And another way you can do it, perhaps the simplest way for just posing, is to make a curve and then give it some features that allow you to pose it easily. So let's start with that option, just creating a curve for rendering. So if I go to Create Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool, and then pop to my front view here, I'm just going to go to X, X, X. I'm holding down X so it snaps to the grid here. Return. So the reason we can do this is that Arnold allows us to render curves now, and I've talked about this in a previous video, so this is nothing too fancy, but it's actually quite handy when you want to make something pretty simple and you don't want to bother trying to generate the geometry. So let's say and I'm going to duplicate this before I do it because I want to demonstrate one other thing too when you've got more than one. But let's start with this one. So we go into the curve shape node, and then in the Arnold menu set we can click on render curve, and we can set the curve width, create a curve shader. So I can just click on this and I'll use a AI standard surface. I'll make it red so it's easy to see. And the other things that we can change here are the curve width, so I'll give it a slightly thicker value before I start to render it. And down here you can change the mode from ribbon to thick, and so thick is more like a noodle, ribbon is more like rendering something flat. So I don't think I turned my light on. Nope. So if I cast some light into the scene and do a render, there you can see sort of the curve rendering, and you can maybe see it's slightly specular because it's using the qualities of the AI standard surface shader. So if I want to make it thicker, I can just go back into its shape node and I can make, say, 0.2 units. I assume this is in units, so Maya units. Let's render this again. Yep, so it's a little bit thicker. Okay, so now you can see it. And let me just put a bigger light in the scene so it's actually easier to see. Sky dome light. Okay, that's better. So now you can see that you can just have a curve and you can render it. Now it's uniformly thick all the way through, but you can actually change this as well. Back in the curve shape node, we've got the shader, we've got the sample rate, and we've got the curve width. There's no obvious way to change the width any way other than this. However, even though it doesn't have one of the map icons over here, you can right click on curve width and say create a new texture. And if you select a ramp, so 2D textures ramp, now you can see that it's using this, so it's going from black, and in Maya of course black means 0 to white to mean 1, and so this looks like it's giving a width of 1. So if we wanted to flip this around, we can just change our ramp. And this is a V ramp. Okay, so it's got to be a V ramp. So if you wanted to taper off towards the end, you can change this. You can change the interpolation, smooth, exponential up to give something like this. And then to make the white part thinner, you just change the color, right? So gray is going to be thinner than white. And so really that's, that's all there is to it, using a ramp in the thickness attribute. Now, the next thing to think about is if you want to pose this, let me just close this thing. Oh, actually, yeah, before I say that, let's say you want to have loads of these things. You got lots of different curves. Rather than having to go into each curve and to change the render curve settings on a case-by-case basis, you can select more than one curve, and in the Arnold menu, go to Curve Collector. It creates a new node, and it will house those two curves. It's like grouping the curves, but in the parent, you can change the settings for each one of these things. So it's going to override the stuff that you have in there. So the shader, we already have a shader, but I'll just make a new one. I could middle mouse drag the old one over there, but can't be bothered. So I'll make this one green just to make sure we can see that it's actually the new shader that's coming into effect. So we can change thick, and I think ours was set to a width of 1. So now let's just do render and see what we get. Right, so we get 2 green ones. This one is closer to the light, so it looks a little bit brighter. There's actually a width profile. Whoops. When you use the AI curve collector. So you don't have it for individual curves, but even if you put 1 into the curve collector, then you actually don't have to do that whole ramp thing. You can just use this AI width profile, which is actually handier. I'm not sure why they don't have it for each curve. And so rather than changing the color, let's close this, you can just go in and tweak this, right? So that's good. There's some other things here. I don't know what these are. Anyway, you can take a look. You can change this to ribbon if you want. It looks essentially the same here, but it's not rounded anymore. It's flat. Oriented. I assume that's probably going to be trying to point. It's a ribbon that's going to point at the camera, although I'm not sure about that. Most of the time I'm going to use thick. And you can put more points in here if you want to be fat in the middle, and so on. Anyway, so that's pretty good. Now if you want to pose something like this, you can do it just like this. If you just go into your contextual menu and you can, select control vertices and change the shape of the curve. You can even use soft selection to make more gradual changes. Whoops. However, another thing you can do, let me just put this back to normal, is that you could turn these CVs into clusters. So let's say I just take one CV, I go to deform, let me see, where's that, deform, so we can create a cluster. So what a cluster is, it's a way to add a transform node to a component. So now I can move this, and you can even animate this and things like that. You can't animate a component. You can't set keyframes on a component, but you can put a cluster on a vertex and make a transform node that can then be animated. Oh, sorry, I had to pause there for a second. And if you want to put clusters on all the CVs, there's a quick way to do that. You can just select them all. And okay, what is it? Control right click and just say to cluster, and now you'll have a cluster for each one of these. Right, so you can then pose your thing however you want it. It's selecting the curve here, which is not really what I want. Turn off my curve selection. So you can pose it, and then when you render, it will respect that pose. So that's a pretty easy way to make a posable hair-like object using curves and the curve collector. Gets a little unwieldy doing something like this. Now another way to do this, and let me just hide all this stuff, is to, again, using a curve, but maybe using a joint system instead to give you maybe a little more posing flexibility. I'm not sure that this is a better method, but let's just make a simple shape. So you can make a hair-like shape easily. I'm just going to make a cylinder, and then I'll just tweak its shape a little bit. Let me just go into the channel box and change its creation parameters so its height. Just make it higher, taller, I mean. Reduce its radius, give it some more subdivisions in height. Can't see what I'm doing here. Something like this, I don't know. Put it up like this. And I can change its shape slightly. So if I select these CVs at the top and hit B, then we can just scale them down to make it sort of tapered at the end. So this is a little less flexible because you're actually changing an object, and with the curve method you could go in and just tweak those parameters. Let me hide that light. So now we'd have to make a joint system to control this, so I'll do that just very quickly. So rigging, skeleton, create joints, and I'll do one every couple of actually, you know what, I'm going to move this so it's not quite, is it right in the middle? It's moved up just a tiny bit. Okay, whatever, not that important. So I'll go back into my skeleton tool, just holding down X to grid snap, and I'll make quite a few of these things. I can see that my scaling has made it go off center a little bit. So let's just say we have something like this, and if we just select this joint system, shift select the, now this is a bit of a pain and you'll see me fumbling around with this a little bit, but if I select a joint system, I'll shift select the cylinder. It's easier to select here, and we'll just go into skin, bind skin, so joint hierarchy using geodesic voxel maybe, and then the max influences, probably want to turn this down, bind skin. So then we get something where we, you can pose it by rotating this. Okay, this is pretty terrible. Let me undo that. Skin, bind skin. Let's keep it to closest distance. Bind skin. See what happens now. Okay, that's better. For this thin object, it seems like the geodesic voxel wasn't really doing what we wanted to do. So you can see you can pose it in this way just by rotating joints around. However, you may want to do something with a curve that will give you a little more control over this, and this is using an IK Spline handle tool. So now the IK Spline handle can create a curve for you, but we're just going to do it ourselves. So using my create curve tool, and I'm going to make a CV every other, actually no, that's too much. I'm going to skip one joint every time. So I'm just lining it up beside it here, and then I'll move it over in just a sec. Okay, so something like this. So we've got this curve. Its pivot point is in a weird spot. So let's hit D, C for curve snap, and snap it to there. D again, W, and then I will just snap it over to the midline. So now this this part is a little bit tricky. So the IK Spline handle tool will allow you to use the deformations on that curve to deform this joint system. All right, so I want to deselect that curve for now, and we'll go to skeleton, create IK Spline handle tool, and we can just the one thing we want to turn off since we created our own curve was auto create curve, right? So now it gives us down at the bottom, it says IK Spline handle tool, use LMB to pick start joint for handle. So left mouse button, click. Then it says to choose the end joint, this one. And now it says to choose the curve. And this is the tricky part because it's sometimes hard to grab that curve because it's right in the middle. So one thing you can do is you can just, under the show menu in this viewport, turn off polygons, turn off joints briefly, and then you can just select that curve. And it's created a new IK handle here. Now I'm going to turn that stuff back on, polygons and joints. So now I don't want to select the joints and I don't want to select the polygons, so I'll turn their selection masks on. So with the curve selected, I can right click and go to control vertex. And now if I take a control vertex and change the shape of the curve, the shape of the geometry will follow. You see my geometry is a little bit low res here. Select this, you can still smooth it to give you better results. So I mean, there's some benefits, I guess, to doing it this way as opposed to doing it the curve way. You have a little more freedom on shaping your geometry the way that you want to shape it. One other thing that you can do, and I'd probably have to paint my weights, so I'm moving this one, the whole thing is moving over. Probably want the weights of the vertices down here to be only applied to this bottom joint. But anyway, one thing you can do, which is kind of sometimes useful, is that if you actually select all the joints, so I'm going to turn my selection mask so I can only select joints now. So I'm selecting from the top of the chain down to the bottom. Oops. Now this is kind of limited applicability, but it could be useful. You actually, now with them all selected separately, you can use scale to, let me just turn off my grid so you can see what's going on here. You can scale, kind of grow this thing along the curve. It kind of messes up your geometry, so if we got in close here, it looks okay still. You can kind of pile up on itself when you get it really compressed like this. You can see the tip is changing a little bit. But you can actually animate this too. You know, you can make a simple controller to do this. So if you want to make your flagella growing, this might be a good way to do it. There's probably a way to do it with the curve too, but I don't know how to do it. Okay, so that's using the curve and then using an IK spline handle on a piece of geometry. Now the last way to do it, I'm just going to hide all this stuff. Hide this, is to use actual hair. So let's just do a really simple example. And one thing you should take note of is, because I'm using a plane, it's avoiding the issue of having good UVs, because a plane will already have its UVs laid out, right? Nice and clean, because the UVs are what are used to distribute the hair onto the surface. So if you model something, you have to make sure there's no overlapping UVs and you've got a nice clean UV layout. You could even just use automatic mapping just to avoid overlap. Anyway, so we take this curve. I'm going to hide my grid again. And this is a dynamic thing, so we have to go under Effects, and we can go to End Hair and Create Hair. You have to open up the options though. I'm going to reset the settings here. So the output that you can create is paint effects and NURBS curves, or just NURBS curves. So you could output NURBS curves and then use the built-in the Arnold ability to render curves. I'm going to leave it on paint effects because Arnold can actually render these paint effects. I'm not sure exactly why, because it doesn't render other types of paint effects sometimes. So anyway, we can tell it to collide with mesh because these are dynamic hairs. They will flop over due to gravity. And if you turn on collide with mesh, they'll collide with the mesh they're born on. Turn up the randomization. So the UV count, this is dividing it into 8 by 8 sectors, so that will give you an idea of how many you'll get. So we should get 64 hair clumps, I guess. I think that's right. And so we can turn up randomization. So each one of these will be a clump, and then there can be hairs within a clump. So I'm going to keep it at 10 right now just to show you, but you could turn this to 1, so there's only 1 hair per clump. Equalize, so this is going to try and avoid groups of things appearing randomly together. Equalize will try and randomly, still be random, but distribute them over the whole surface. So points per hair, this is like how many CVs each curve has. And the more points they have, the more flexible they'll be, the more complex their dynamic deformations can be, but of course it will take longer to calculate. And then the length is the length of each hair. So I'm going to make these 10 each, and it will create a new hair system. I don't have a hair system here yet. Anything else? So create hairs. Right, so we get something like this. So you can see they're fairly evenly distributed over the surface, and they are clumps. So you can see each one has a number of hairs associated with each. So let's look at one of these things. It's kind of hard to see. If we get in close, each one has this little red thing. This is called a follicle. And we'll talk about how these follicles can be useful in other ways later. But these are the things that lock the hairs and the hair clumps to the surface. So this hair system follicles contains all these follicles. The hair system itself has the dynamic attributes associated with this. Now this is N hair, so it's in the nucleus system. So you have a nucleus node, and it's got sort of your overall dynamic settings. I'm going to turn off gravity, so just in the nucleus node, turn gravity to 0. I'm going to go back into the hair system shape, and you'll see that you can set collisions here. You can do clump and hair shape, so I can change that clump hair number now to 1. I'm going to go back to 10. Clump twist, clump width, so if you want them tighter, you can do something like that. And you can change the hair width here. Clump width fall off, so you can, right now you can see there's sort of, the clumps are tapering towards the end here. That's what this is doing. Hair width does the same thing, and so on. You can also turn on turbulence in here. So it's kind of an interesting thing. The hair system shape has its own built-in turbulence, and if I give myself some more frames, you know, I turned off gravity, right? So this movement is just that built-in turbulence. And they will collide with the ground if they get there, but they shouldn't get there because I think there's a stiffness scale. I can't remember where that is. Maybe in dynamic properties. Well, we've got stretch, compression resistance, bend resistance, stiffness scale. Here it is. So you can see it's very stiff at its base. It's less stiff at its tip. So if we reduce the stiffness at the base, then they might just flop right over. Yeah, so you can see they're almost falling right over. Probably want to keep that turned up. So this is a really useful method for creating this type of thing if you want it to be animated. And if we wanted to respond to, say, the motion of this plane. So if I animated this plane moving, one of the really useful things here is these follicles stay stuck to the plane. And as it moves, they will react to the transformations of the plane, and you can kind of get an interesting effect here. What you're giving up is the ability to really pose the hairs. There are ways you can do that, but in some way, I'm not sure that it's worth it. You can set control curves for these, but one way you can approach it, if it's for a still image, you can just let the animation play through until it's in a state that you want, and you can render your image like that. So now Arnold, I should save my scene here. Now Arnold, I think, should be able to render these. Yeah, I think I've got a super bright light in here. Yeah, so I just turned down the intensity of my sky dome light. If we go back into the hair system shape, we can see that there is a place to change the you can add a hair shader here in Arnold, so there is an Arnold tab here, but there's also, oh yeah, if you just want to use the defaults, there's a shading thing. You can just change the hair color here to whatever you want. And you can see that the rendering quality is not that good. If we turn up the Arnold camera AA, let's see if that helps solve that. Yep, that's a little bit better. And there are some other things that you can set here. So there are some kind of easy to access built-in things. I'm sorry, my email is going crazy. That you can access in here. You can, of course, use the Arnold settings if you want to add a hair shader and so on. There are lots of other things that you can do. You can see that some of those curve rendering things are available to you in here as well. But those are just 3 ways that you can make flagella-like hairs that are good for either posing or using in dynamic animation. I hope you find it useful. Thanks.